In the last 3 years, I've published 3 or 4 articles on Shin Hanga, the new print movement in America, and really the marketing of it. How did this movement in the 1920s become popular in America and not in Europe? How did other print movements, the Sosaku Hanga, the creative print, the rival movement, not become popular in America in the 20s and 30s, only to become popular in the post-war period? And so this is research that has really kind of engrossed me and led to a number of publications, and I hope changed the field a little bit. And it's a story that's not only about Indianapolis, but it started in Indianapolis. I don't remember if it was when I was here in 1996, maybe it was 2004, but I wrote to the curator Jim Robinson at that time and said, I'm going to be in town. Do you have any Shin Hanga prints? I'm interested in this artist, Yoshida Hideoshi. And he said, well, we have a few prints, but really looking in the curatorial file, we have a letter that he visited here in the 20s. And, you know, he showed me the letter, and this, it wasn't that the light bulb went on, but this little bit of information. Yoshida Hideoshi is in Indianapolis. Well, he must have been in other places, Chicago and Cleveland and Cincinnati, and he's writing letters to museum curators and offering to give a print, and he wants a meeting. This is really interesting. I should look into it more. Well, a decade passed, and when I was working on the Toledo Museum of Art catalog about 3 years ago and writing an essay on this subject, it all came together. Now, Toledo asked me to write that catalog because or work on that catalog, edit it, because they thought the Toledo Museum had been the museum that had first exhibited Shin Hanga in America in 1930. Everybody, all the scholars in the field, myself included, had long written that. And it was this man, J. Arthur McLean, together with his kind of assistant, confrere, colleague, perhaps more, Dorothy Blair, who were the curator and the assistant curator of Oriental art at the Toledo Museum in the 1929-30, who organized this famous show. As it turns out, Toledo was quite disappointed with my essay because they weren't the star. Indianapolis was the star. It was Indianapolis, when it was in the John Herron Institute of Art days, that broke the Shin Hanga movement in America. And in fact, this man, J. Arthur McLean, had written in the 30s, oh, it was all Toledo. But he had a kind of grudge against his former employer here. So I will tell this story today. I'm going to conclude, though, with another story. So we're going to start with Shin Hanga in America, the Indianapolis connection. And the second part, the conclusion of the lecture, is how and why North Americans acquire Japanese landscape prints. First part is how: marketing, exhibitions, networks of museums, museum professional groups, people who navigate these networks. The last part is, so what was the content of these prints that once they were marketed made people want them? Has anybody read the book, The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell? A few of you. So he talks about things that are popular have to be what he calls sticky. They have to have appeal. They make us want to use them, think about them. But then they also have to have people, connectors, people who have broad social connections, mavens, people with deep knowledge, and salesmen, people with special abilities to sell things. And I'm going to suggest to you it was 2 people. This guy, J. Arthur McLean, who is the director of the John Herron Institute of Art from 1923 to 1926, and his friend, Yoshida Hideoshi, who he met here in 1924, that these 2 men brought together in this city at the predecessor of this museum that established Shin Hanga in America. And it's not just to say, well, established in America, so what? It's possible that without that connection of Yoshida and McLean here in 1924, the movement might never have become popular. And if it had never become popular in the 20s, maybe the publishers would have shut down, printed less, and then a whole 50-year movement never would have taken place. And if you think that's hyperbole, one dealer and one collector tried to introduce Shin Hanga in Europe in the 1930s, and it failed. They didn't have the connections. They weren't mavens, connectors, salesmen. And so Philadelphia, I was in Philadelphia last week, Indianapolis, these Greco-Roman city names, really is critical, not just a good story, but really the way a place, to a degree, it's a bit of a coincidence, brings people together and really makes an artistic movement. So I'm going to hopefully demonstrate that to you. That's the wrong thing, and that's the right thing. So the Shin Hanga movement. Shin Hanga new prints is the creation of the publisher, Watanabe Shozaburo, who you see on the left with his son. Watanabe was originally a producer of reprints of old ukiyo-e, the popular prints from the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1915, Watanabe, and that is his shop in the middle slide and another shop that he owned in the lower right, he began a new line of prints, high-quality, so-called creative new prints, Sosaku Shin Hanga, that combined Western academic or even post-impressionist styles with some of the graphic qualities of old ukiyo-e prints. Watanabe also used the familiar method of production, using a block carver and a printer to translate the artist's design into finished print. Once Watanabe had established a stable of artists to produce work that fulfilled his new objectives, a little bit old, a little bit new, around 1920, Watanabe began to market these prints to Japanese audiences through exhibitions at a department store in Tokyo. Here you see the kind of pamphlet, and it's in Japanese only, so we can pretty safely assume a Japanese audience is intended. So a primary Japanese audience, but Watanabe also started exporting his prints through auctions in New York, and this is thanks to modern newspaper database research done by my wife. You can look in the New York Times and type in the word Shin Hanga or Hasui or Yoshida, the major artists, and now you get a hit. So this is Walpole Galleries 1920, 21, 22. They're selling auctions, old prints, Kuniyoshi, Hiroshige, but also the moderns. Distinguished moderns, Goyo, Hasui. This is as early as 2021, but these sales are very minor. So initially, the sale of prints in America was a bonus for Watanabe, whose primary market was Japan. However, the destruction of the domestic sales within Japan and tourist trades, foreigners coming to Japan, that came with the Great Tokyo earthquake of September 1st, 1923, then meant that American sales became essential as Japanese sales dried up. After that disaster, killed almost 100,000 people and burned 70% of Tokyo and Yokohama, the publisher Watanabe asked an artist, Yoshida Hideoshi, an oil painter with whom he had produced just 5 prints in 1920 and 21, he asked Yoshida to try and market this new Shin Hanga in America. Yoshida was going to America. He had scheduled a trip from December 1923 to sell paintings of the so-called Pacific Painting Society, Taihei Yogakai, a conservative Western oil and Japanese ink painting school of which Yoshida was the president. So as Yoshida was going to tour America yet again, he had lived in America from 1899 on and off to 1906, painting in artists' colonies, selling his art through museums and galleries. In fact, the art of watercolors of one of his close colleagues were purchased by this museum in 1904. Yoshida was familiar with America. He was knowledgeable, the specialist. He was the maven. He was the connector. He had gone speaking English to galleries across America in 1900, 1904, 1906. So Watanabe wisely says, Yoshida, why don't you take a few of my prints, and including a couple of Yoshida's designs, and sell them together with your paintings. So in December 1923, Yoshida and his wife Fujio, you see a new magazine illustration of them from their earlier tour in America in 1905, they sailed from Yokohama for San Francisco. In December 1923, they arrived in San Francisco, and Yoshida, ever the salesman, the very first thing he did was go to the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, meet with its president, director J. Nilsson Lorvik, and asked Lorvik to write a letter to the museum directors across the country, a letter of introduction for Yoshida, this exhibit of paintings and a few prints meant to earn money for Japanese artists negatively affected by the terrible earthquake. And Lorvik utilized the newly formed Museum Directors Network. So if you read Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about these agents or people, active, dynamic people, the mavens, the collectors, the connectors, the salesmen, and then networks. Things like the American Association of Museums Directors, and it's together, these networks and actors that can break a social movement. So using this letter, and that's the actual letter, you see him saying, this will introduce you to Mr. Yoshida, the exhibition is worthy, any assistance you can give him. And this letter, this is from the Cincinnati Museum, but it was sent to every museum director in the country. Yoshida, using the letter and his extensive connections and his chutzpah, I guess. He traveled around the country, set up exhibitions at galleries and museums in Boston, Washington, New York, Seattle, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee. These are reviews of the exhibition from the Milwaukee newspapers. And the last stop of the exhibition was Indianapolis. Here is the list. So Boston, New York, Washington. Oh, see, I also went to Seattle. Cleveland, I left out the Art Institute of Chicago. Too bad, I used to work there. And then John Herron Institute of Art. The Milwaukee catalog, so what was the content of this show? As I say, this was an exhibition that was unknown to specialists in the field such as myself just until a few years ago. The Milwaukee catalog, as well as the price list for the exhibition from the John Herron Institute, revealed that the exhibition had 32 landscape prints by Kawase Hasui, 8 prints of beauties by the artist Ito Shinsui, 3 prints in the collection now, 2 prints by Yoshida Hideoshi, 31 paintings by him, and 31 other paintings by artists of this Pacific Painting Society. The prints were, and here's just a sampling of the 2 by Yoshida and some of the 32 by Hasui, the prints were priced at $10, except for those 2 by Yoshida, which were priced at $20. The paintings, however, were marked at $25 to $75. Now, of course, the prints were multiple originals, the paintings one of a kind. However, whereas the paintings were singular works, and as they would be sold from each exhibition, the exhibition would get smaller, multiple copies of the prints were carried around by Yoshida and his wife. Print sales were strong. A letter from the Cleveland Museum shows that during the month the exhibition was there, almost 100 prints were sold. Paintings, however, were not as popular. And this is the bulletin for the Cleveland Museum of Art from 1924, the year-end bulletin listing all of the report on the year. And so this is new acquisitions page of the Cleveland Bulletin. And it shows that the Cleveland Museum purchased 2 woodblock prints by Kawase Hasui. Here they are. It acquired from the artist by gift 1 painting by Yoshida Hideoshi. Well, Yoshida was a good artist, but he was perhaps an equally good businessman, and he could read the writing on the wall. Americans no longer wanted the paintings that he had sold from 1899 to 1906. They wanted Japanese prints. So this experience convinced Yoshida that he must really change his artistic practice and build a better business model. And so on his return to Tokyo in August 1925, he set up his own print studio, producing over 50 prints in just the 5 months remaining in the year. So now Yoshida he's entered into the world. He's become a print publisher, publishing his own prints. But he's also a businessman, a collector, a connector, a maven, a salesman. So to showcase this new work that he had produced and that of other print artists, Yoshida organized several small exhibits in Tokyo, and then a large Shin Hanga new print movement exhibition for North America, which would feature 25 of his landscapes, 22 landscapes by Hasui, I'm emphasizing landscapes for reasons that'll be clear at the end, and diverse prints by 6 other artists. To organize the show, and here is the list from this museum's archives, and thank the archivist very much for kindly finding them. This is the prices and the lists. So there's Yoshida Prints, there's a few by Shinsui, here's a lot by Hasui, a few by other artists. To organize the exhibition, Yoshida teamed up with his old friend J. Arthur McLean, director of the John Herron Institute of Art in Indianapolis. The exhibit debuted simultaneously debuted here in Indianapolis on October 3rd, 1926, but clearly multiple copies of the prints were brought because just 9 days later, the same exhibit was opened at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. So there were multiple copies of the prints. It was up in Brooklyn, it was up in Indianapolis. It then traveled to Montclair, New Jersey, Worcester, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Denver, and Dayton. And perhaps, we're not sure, there were plans to travel it to Minneapolis, Toronto, Ottawa, Buffalo, Vancouver. They couldn't find archives in those museums, but it's possible it went to some of those places. When MacLean left Indianapolis, and I might reveal the reason why in the Q&A period to tease you a little, when MacLean moved from being director of Indianapolis to curator of Oriental art at the Toledo Museum of Art in 1927, he and Yoshida teamed up again for another massive survey exhibition, and this one is the exhibition that served as the tipping point for the reception of Shin Hanga New Prints in America. A little background first on J. Arthur McLean. Who is this figure that organizes this famous show for Toledo in 1930 that we all thought was the show, the first and really only, but in fact had been at Indianapolis as director earlier? McLean, this is in fact a page from the bulletin of the Art Institute of Chicago when he got the job there. MacLean was educated at Harvard. He worked at the famous Japanese art department at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston under the very famous scholar curator Okakura Kakuzo. The article claims, I guess MacLean claims, that he was given the name Oka Katana. At any rate, after the MFA Boston, he became chief curator at Cleveland, 1917 to 21, left that job very briefly to be assistant director and chief curator of Oriental art and prints and drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago, it was sort of late 21, 22. By 23, he was gone. He moves here in 23, becomes director, and is director here from 23 until 26, 27, where he then moves on to the Toledo Museum of Art as curator. So his first Shin Hanga shows here, taking a show that traveled and then organizing one in 24 and again in 26. So let's look at one other important figure. This is Dorothy Blair. Somehow the old version of my PowerPoint is in here with empty images. Sorry about that. I've added her dates later, but close enough. Dorothy Blair was the author of the 1930 Toledo exhibition catalog, and she often gets credited with sort of being one of the first to found, to discover, to unveil Shin Hanga in America. A very interesting story which might relate to why MacLean was released as director here. So Blair, who's born, I think about, she's born something like 1879, dies 1980. She lives to be about 100. She graduates from Mount Holyoke in 1914, works 2 years as the assistant to the director of the gallery at that college, moves to the Cleveland Museum of Art as secretary to the director in 1917 to 21, the same time that MacLean is assistant director. When MacLean moves to Chicago 21, 22, she moves with him, becomes assistant curator of Oriental art. When he becomes director here from 22 to 26, she comes here as curator of prints and drawings and assistant to the director. You're sensing a pattern. When he leaves here and moves up to, is demoted from director, leaves being director here, he was fired. The 1926 John Herron Institute newsletter for fall says we announce, the board announces the separation of the director. We wish him well. In the winter issue of the bulletin, they say, oh, he's found a new job at Toledo. So it seems clear he was fired and gets a job there. At any rate, while he's being fired, Blair leaves here for 1 year in Europe, 1928, study year in Japan, Kyoto Imperial University, where she also meets Yoshida through the connections she'd established here. And then by 28, all the way, I think the date, sorry, I corrected this in the final version, which we loaded the wrong one. She works at Toledo all the way into the late 50s before retiring. So, Blair and MacLean, who together are really responsible, along with Yoshida, for launching Shin Hanga in America, a story that starts, well, their story starts at Cleveland, but Shin Hanga, it really starts here in Indianapolis, and then Toledo, remember the 1930 show, which is where we had left off. They work together on what is often seen as the first, but incorrectly so, but it really is the tipping point. Why is the Toledo show the tipping point? First, the sheer number of prints. At Toledo, 340 prints were exhibited. Again, landscape, to foreshadow my conclusion, comprised more than half of these 342 prints. There was also a catalog. Oh, by the way, Yoshida got other prints were double hung, crowded together. Yoshida's prints got much more space. After all, he had curated the show, so a little extra award. In addition to the massive scale, 342 prints of this Toledo show in 1930, a catalog was published, and it was the first ever to illustrate Shin Hanga comprehensively through an appendix of thumbnail photos with data on carvers, printers, signatures, seals, and edition sizes. Everything dealers, curators, collected need. The Toledo exhibition also spread Shin Hanga physically, circulating the prints to 10 other museums across the U.S. And in fact, this is the schedule for the circuit. They called them not traveling shows, but circuit exhibitions. It was called the Exhibition of Modern Woodblock Prints. Interestingly, it did not go to Indianapolis. I think Yoshida and Blair, as former employees who were let go, are looking at other venues. There was a organization of Ohio art museums. So MacLean really got it to a lot of Ohio institutions, Cincinnati, Columbus, Dayton, Columbus again. And just my early theme about it's not just active connectors, maven salesmen who make a movement possible. Of course, it's the work itself, but there need to be networks. When I saw this is data gathered from the archives at Toledo, and it shows when, how much these institutions paid to take this huge traveling show of 342 prints. It's now the Depression. It's after the stock market crash. It's very little. And it shows when they signed the contract. And I thought, okay, who cares when they signed the contract? But I noticed, strangely, May 22nd, 1930, 3 different museums signed the contract. Could this be a coincidence? I think it could not. One of my former students who had formerly been in naval intelligence said the first law of intelligence is there's no such thing as coincidence. So I looked up what's happening on May 22nd. There must be some convention. The Art Association of America, the Association of American Museums, AAM, had its annual conference on May 21st, 22nd, 1930. Clearly, MacLean went. He buttonholed a lot of his friends who, when he was museum director and he was on the board, he was the secretary of the executive board of the American Association of Museum Directors, and so he got them all to sign up and pay their check for the exhibition on the same day. So again, the importance of networks as well as the human agents who surf them and utilize those networks. So the Toledo exhibition went to a number of venues, traveled across America, ending up, and amazing MacLean as an organizer. I mean, I've traveled exhibitions, that it went every month, it went to another exhibition. Just the amazing, and his letters to all of these curators, he's cajoling the directors, take it, we'll make it easy, you can do all these things, you'll make money, it's the Depression now, you need every penny, we'll drop the price, good publicity. He worked it and worked it hard. So Shin Hanga in 1930 is exhibited in a massive scale. There's a catalog that you can buy. It sort of comes together. It coalesces. It has kind of critical mass. It travels to 10 venues across the Midwest from coast to coast. And at each venue, most importantly, and this is a continuation of the 1926-27 Indianapolis organized show, viewers could purchase prints not directly from the museum, but they could order prints through Yoshida in Tokyo. And this is, in fact, a copy of the catalog, that the Cincinnati Museum kept in their archive. It shows the prices. Now it's the Depression. Bird and flower prints have gone down to $2. And it also shows that each time a print was sold, they started with, Yoshida had told them there's 50 available, and so each time one is ordered, you check it off the list. And so we see the checklist, and we can really see how many prints sold. For art historians doing social art history, what becomes popular? What did people want? This is just a treasure trove of information. At Toledo, this is the sales log for the prints sold through Toledo, and it shows us a number of things. It shows us that Helen Gunceles, the curator of Asian art at the Art Institute of Chicago, bought a number of prints directly from the show. Whether for herself or for the museum is not entirely clear. That same sales list at Toledo, taken in its entirety, shows that there were about 75 purchasers in February 1930 in Toledo, and for every one male purchaser, there were 3 women who bought prints. Although women tended to buy cheaper prints than men, and they often bought small landscapes or bird and flower prints. So the sorts of things we can learn from this data. By 1930, the efforts of Yoshida and MacLean, who had met here in Indianapolis in 1924, really paid off, because Shin Hanga by this time was really ubiquitous across America. A handful of dealers, in addition to curators like MacLean, were spreading Shin Hanga and selling it in venues from museums to shops, where Shin Hanga now competed with ukiyo-e, and it was really seen as the modern ukiyo-e. If you liked ukiyo-e, you will like Shin Hanga. You can buy both of them. They're exhibited, sold together. For instance, in 1929, Helen Gunceles, who we saw buying prints in 1930 at Toledo, as early as 1929, Helen Gunceles, MacLean's successor as Oriental Art Curator at Chicago, exhibited a small group of Shin Hanga given to the Art Institute by 2 female collectors, females again, who had purchased prints from the dealer S.H. Modi in Chicago. Modi also organized traveling exhibitions, including one showing landscape prints by Hiroshige, landscape prints by Kiyochika from the late 19th century, and contemporary Shin Hanga by Hasui and others. And this show traveled around venues, and for one of the venues in 1929 was Grace Nicholson's Oriental Treasure House in Pasadena, where I used to work as curator once it shifted from a gallery to a museum. Grace Nicholson also had Shin Hanga prints in 1930 and 31. Just the sense of the ubiquity and how it spreads out from its origins really in Indianapolis. Japanese print publishers were also seeking American buyers and doing so through small circuit exhibitions. One of the most active print publishers was an importer-exporter named Kawaguchi Jiro, who in 1929 partnered with the book publisher Sakai Shokichi to establish a stable of artists, including Pochin Hasui from the publisher Watanabe. Then Sakai and Kawaguchi exhibited small print exhibits at universities, schools. This is the newspaper from Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, showing a Japanese prints, Hokusai's Red Fuji, as well as Shin Hanga, is shown ukiyo-e reprints along with fresh Shin Hanga for sale. These importer-exporters really looked at every possible venue. For example, Macy's department store in New York in the early 30s, the depths of the Depression, was selling Shin Hanga from Kawaguchi, Sakai, Hasui, Koson, and others for prices from $1.94 to $5.74. I guess in the Depression you counted every penny, no rounding up. By the start of the Depression, and I think the Depression is an important era, Shin Hanga exhibitions were absolutely common across America, appearing in museum exhibitions across the country, often from female collectors and organized by female curators. Again, this sort of gendered aspect. For example, just one example, but there are several others, in San Antonio, Texas, The Whitty Museum has a curator named Eleanor Underdonk, and she in 1931 organizes a Shin Hanga exhibit of about 30 prints from Marion McNay. Marion McNay fell in love with Japan and contemporary art, and there's now the McNay Museum in San Antonio. Goodspeed's bookstore in Boston had an exhibition of modern woodblock prints, Shin Hanga. The local Boston newspaper called it, quote, a remarkably handsome show, one to gladden the late Okakura. Remember, he's the curator at Boston, the teacher of MacLean, and Okakura, who regretted the cheapening of Japanese artistry in the modern age. These prints, one feels, the exhibition review continues, are technically the standard of 18th century ukiyo-e. They rise to a level of dignity and beauty, end quote from the newspaper. Indeed, Shin Hanga had entered the fabric of American private and institutional collecting. That show from the Goodspeed's bookshop goes, as this letter shows, to the Isaac Delgado Museum of Art in New Orleans. This is in the New Orleans Museum of Art now. So bookshops to museums, galleries, museums, the sort of interface between commerce and institution is well established. In the Depression, an age of declining resources and considerable anxiety, Japanese prints, Shin Hanga, were affordable for the middle class and for museums collecting on lean budgets. Moreover, the familiar styles and romanticizing subjects of Shin Hanga resonated at a time of economic and social upheaval. By the late 1930s, however, the saturation of the market, these are just the sort of common prints that would have been shown, Hasui prints, at that time. By the 1930s, however, mid-30s, the oversaturation of Shin Hanga in the market, as well as deteriorating political relations with Japan, brought a decline in Shin Hanga exhibitions and sales. In 1936, for example, Yoshida and MacLean collaborated on a third Shin Hanga circuit exhibition. This one including 289 prints by 10 artists over the previous 5 years, 1930 to 35. The Toledo Museum of Art again organized the show, circulated it through the College Art Association, again another network. However, this show traveled only to Chattanooga, Tennessee, Springfield, Massachusetts, and Seattle. And sales outside of Toledo, where they still sold well, were sparse relative to both the 1930 exhibition and presumably the 1926-27 one. And I should point out that even into the late 30s, Shin Hanga is being sold. This is the company, Shima Art Company. There's the E.T. Shima Art in New York from around 1908 to 1940. It goes out of business. Robert Muller, who's the greatest collector of Shin Hanga in America, buys the company in 1940 on the verge of World War II, and sells almost nothing, of course, in 1940, 41, or during the war years. But after the war, Shin Hanga comes storming back. The movement boomed commercially during the occupation of Japan when American GI and other personnel bought Shin Hanga at officers' clubs and at post exchanges. Often they were buying reprints, and sometimes new prints, more than pre-war originals. We're going to skip that slide. Yoshida was one of the leaders, of course, of this post-war occupation sales boom, and Yoshida's famous sales talks were even featured in the military newspaper Stars and Stripes, which you see here, and it discusses him, world-famous print artists, occupation forces, PX, souvenir shops, bought by Eighth Army officials. MacArthur's wife visits Yoshida's studio as early as October 1945. So this is how quickly Shin Hanga is being reintegrated back into American society. However, in this new incarnation of preference among Americans, Shin Hanga was becoming a tourist commodity, a souvenir as much as a type of art. And here very much is that newspaper quote, a popular souvenir to purchase as a memory of Japan and send back home. By the mid-1950s, despite the Japanese government's declaration in 1954 of color woodblock printing, the process itself as an intangible cultural property, another kind of tipping point was reached. Now it was a negative one for Shin Hanga. Art historians and serious collectors, whether it's Fujikake Shizuya, who writes articles in a book, he's writing an article here, this guy, Fujikake, a leading Japanese scholar, on contemporary prints in a Japanese magazine, and he's really saying it's not Shin Hanga, it's a new style of print, Sosaku Hanga, creative prints. This is what represents Japan as a modern democratic nation in the post-war period. And indeed, American collectors, scholars, James Michener, Oliver Statler, who we see there, who are organizing exhibitions, writing books on Japanese prints in the World War II, found it, as well as collectors, found it difficult to respect a movement like Shin Hanga associated with abundance, not rarity, with the feudal production system dominated by a publisher as opposed to self-carved, self-printed motto of Sosaku Hanga artists. They found it hard to resonate to a style that seemed outmoded, romantic, maybe even garish, and with an art for middle-brow taste, stacks of it in the officers' club and the Post-Exchange. In the post-war era, as the creative prints movement emerged as the serious school of modern Japanese prints, Shin Hanga now served as the negative measure. What Sosaku Hanga had gone beyond. The avant-garde has to transcend something outmoded and historic. However, as attested by exhibitions of Shin Hanga around America, as well as a show in January of this year at Takashimaya department store in Tokyo, where 70,000 people came to see Hasui prints. This is just the window displays, the prints were upstairs, in 10 days, 70,000 people in 10 days. Shin Hanga has, in the last decade or two, been rediscovered by collectors, by museums, by art historians, and in terms of sheer units sold, hundreds of thousands of Shin Hanga have been produced in the market over the last 100 years since the founding of the movement. There are several reasons why Shin Hanga has been so popular, but I want to conclude by suggesting some of the properties, what Gladwell calls the sticky quality of something, that have made Shin Hanga and Shin Hanga landscapes as the center of the genre so mesmerizing to so many people for so long. And I want to do this by proposing that Shin Hanga landscapes epitomize some fundamental human preferences for specific kinds of nature. In essence, Shin Hanga landscapes provide images of nature, whether wilderness nature or what sometimes is called nearby nature. They provide images of nature that are vital to human functioning by showing the kinds of places where people feel they can function most effectively. Now, fundamental to this kind of analysis is the idea that broad preference, what people like, what common people like, preference something that is often marginalized as frivolous and uninformed taste in contrast to expert appraisal, that preference is in fact the deep result of complex analytic processes. In their famous, or perhaps infamous, People's Choice study of 1997, and there's a product of it on the left, the Russian conceptual artists Komar and Malamud commissioned research companies, advertising firms in 11 countries around the world to use scientific polling to determine what kind of art and music people want and don't want to see or to hear. In their study, based on these 11 research forums, there was a universal preference for green and blue landscapes with water and signs of human presence. So the advertising firms got all of this hard empirical data, put it together, and then Vitaly Komar and Alexander Malamud made paintings which sort of encapsulated what the respondents had said. And they made a painting based on the specific descriptions of the most preferred landscape for each country. This is the favorite landscape, according to Komar and Malamud's recreation for people in Poland. And I contrast it with a kind of common Hasui landscape from Shin Hanga. Really remarkably similar. Now, of course, Komar and Malamud were sort of conceptual artists making fun of popular taste, the democratization of culture, and they said rather flippantly, dismissively, popularity is the dictator in the capitalist world. I mean, that's a left-wing critique or conceptual art critique. But nonetheless, we know what humans prefer through their study. And in fact, their results reinforce the analysis of preference in landscape by environmental psychologists over the last 40 years. These studies were in fact inspired by the cultural geographer J. Appleton's famous book of 1974 called The Experience of Landscape, in which Appleton argued that successful and enduring kinds of landscape art satisfy our inborn desire to have broad views, what he called prospect, a sense of opportunity and exploration, but at the same time what he called refuge, safety, a place where we can hide. And he argues that from our ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors over hundreds of generations, baked into our DNA is the desire to look at, enjoy, and prefer landscapes where we can look out and where we can hide if need be. And if you look at woodblock prints, not Hokusai's Great Wave, but even Hiroshige, Kyochika in the Meiji period, throughout Shin Hanga landscapes, many of the most successful ones have this uncanny balance of what Appleton calls prospect, broad view, and refuge, safety place. The most engaged studies of the psychology of landscape preference are those by the University of Michigan scholars Stephen and Rachel Kaplan. Beginning with the book Cognition in the Environment, the Kaplans have determined through empirical research that humans, quote, prefer, and they use this term preference a lot, excuse me, optimal living environments. Optimal living environments defined as an ideal place where man is in harmony with nature, best evidenced in open yet spatially structured views that include water, vistas to the horizon, diverse plants, and explicit or implicit signs of human habitation. So these would include, of course, a path would be explicit, or even clearing of timber on the hillsides would be implicit human habitation. Structurally, according to the Kaplan's empirical research, these kind of ideal preferred environments are marked by moderate complexity. And they define moderate complexity as having visual coherence. We look at them at a glance and we can understand them. But they also say beyond this coherence, they have legibility. When we go beyond the glance and start to look carefully, we can imagine ourselves doing things in the scene. Next, the Kaplans postulate, again, that people prefer landscapes that have complexity. At a glance, although you can understand it, there's something more going on. And when you start to think about it deeply, these landscapes have mystery, the promise that one could learn more. And these qualities of mystery, complexity, legibility, and coherence, they write, are best realized where, quote, the foreground is clearly seen, but an important part of the landscape known to be present is nevertheless concealed, end quote. Their analysis fits well with the famous 1970 study, The Introduction to Landscape Design by Henry Hubbard and Theodora Kimball. He was a professor at Harvard, she was a student, they got married, they wrote a famous textbook and did a lot of important early studies on landscape design. And the Hubbards write that humans are drawn to a riverbank that disappears around a bend, or a walking path that leads into a fertile valley, end quote. In their next study, The Experience of Nature, the Kaplans proposed that such landscapes are preferred because they function as what the Kaplans call restorative environments. The Kaplans adopted the philosopher and father of modern psychology, William James' notion of voluntary and involuntary attention. William James maintained that voluntary attention, like you're driving down a freeway in Los Angeles, you're crossing a ice-slicked road in Chicago in January, you have to be fully engaged, prolonged directed attention. That is voluntary attention. But voluntary attention, although necessary for us humans not to get into accidents or fall down, is stressful. In contrast, James discussed, and the Kaplans picked up on, the idea of involuntary attention that is deeply restorative. And in their next study of attention, what they call attention restoration theory, very nicely for an art historian, and the acronym is ART, the Kaplans hold that restorative landscapes are premised on 4 qualities. First is the sense of being away. We have to be in some way, at least even a little, escaping from our daily mundane routine. So if we work in an office, even a sort of quiet street with a lot of trees, nearby nature, a park, can take us away from our normative experience. In urban societies, and clearly 20th century Japan and American urban societies, integration into this mental content different from the norm is most basically, most easily, and most successfully satisfied by nature. So we all live, or most of us live in cities, in urban environments, and our easiest, closest being away is nature. So, second quality of restorative landscape, according to the Kaplans' empirical research, is that this new environment, this away place, must be, quote, a whole other world. It must have scope and connectedness. They sometimes later called this quality extent, and by it, or coherence. And that is the thing that they say, even small spaces seem vast conceptually. So when you're in this place, you're there, it's away, but when you're there and you're nowhere else. The Kaplans write of this quality of kind of connectedness or extent, it's a world into itself, a microcosm. Quote, there must be sufficient connectedness to make it possible for the viewer to build a mental map, and sufficient scope to make building that mental map seem worthwhile. Equally critical for the Kaplans in their restorative landscapes is the quality of fascination, a pleasurable stimulus to attention or a stimulus to reflective engagement. Now, fascination may be dramatic, and they talk about waterfalls, caves, towering peaks. But they say fascination is more often the soft fascination of, look at the print at the left, the soft fascination, and I'm really quoting from the soft fascination of clouds, of sunsets, at the play of light and shadow, the texture of leaves on the breeze, leaves in the breeze. The last of their 4 characteristics of restorative landscapes is what they call compatibility to view, by which the Kaplans mean the compatibility among environmental patterns and human actions required to navigate those patterns, or phrased slightly differently, compatibility between the viewer's purposes, inclinations in looking, and the environment's limitations or demands. The result is a satisfaction of union between us, the viewer, and something larger, older, greater than oneself. And they quote the philosopher William James again, this time in his famous 1890 book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, where James described the sense of the belief that there is an unseen order in the world, and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. Now, by way of final conclusion, I do not want to, as insightful as the ideas of the Kaplans or Appleton or even the Russian conceptual artists are, these insights from environmental psychology and human opinion polling, I don't want to suggest that these things alone create the frame by which we assess the impact and the appeal of Shin Hanga landscapes. There are other resonant theories that we may look at, and I talked about this a little this morning with your wonderful print group. For example, the famous 1960s, 70s scholar Victor Turner talked about ideas of liminality, a kind of threshold or transition space betwixt or between, and that people, societies need this sense of a kind of sense of moving from one place to another. And that might well explain why in Shin Hanga landscapes Morning or evening scenes are most common, but it's more often evening. Evening moves us from the brightness, the fullness, the clarity of day to the unknown, the half-seen of evening. Other resonant theories might be the Japanese aesthetics of transience, Buddhist ideas of mujokan, evanescence, transience, or perhaps more discreetly the aesthetics of twilight. In Japanese, akogare, twilight, who goes there? The time of mystery, the time of fantasy. I think, however, in conclusion, we can say that the power of place is broad, the power of place is deep, and as such, it's enduring. Thank you.